Today, I am chatting with Marc Warnke for a little backstory on how this came to be. I got a video of Marc explaining pack goats. I knew nothing about pack goats. We've had Scottish Highland cattle here, and while we absolutely love having them around, to me, life is short and utility is important. And pack goats seem to be a way that I'm going to be able to get gear down to the water. We've got a pretty treacherous trail down to our creek. I think we're going to learn about usefulness for pack goats in the backcountry, exploring and hunting. And I think it's a lot easier than managing a 1,500-pound large horn steer. So I didn't think I'd sell my Highlands as fast as I did. I sold them in a couple of weeks. I had sold our cattle, and now I'm planning the next phase of bringing on goats. And I've got a lot of questions for Marc. And with all of that said, Marc, will you start off by giving us a little look into your history?
Yeah, so it's the old what got me here, right? So what got me here was God and fate. I wouldn't have ever imagined. I was a bioengineering major in high school. I was a smart kid. I was a collegiate athlete. I think if my mom had a hope for me, it would have been to be a doctor or some type of professional. And once I was in my second year of college, I realized I was wasting my time. Holy crap. I wanted to go into business for myself. I didn't think I could make philanthropic differences in the world in business because I had been told that's where the evil people live. And so now that I figured out that I could be philanthropic and kind and thoughtful and grateful and considerate of other people around me through the business system, and I could hold that, I never looked back. I'm a hunting consultant. I've been that for 30 years. So I'm the guy you call if you want to go on an elk hunt in Colorado or a moose hunt in Alaska. And I'm the guy that knows the right people. So that's my company that I've been doing for a long time that's always paid the bills. And to talk about my goat life, that ended up being my profession as well, is that I had the yearn to get my wife and kids in the backcountry, and it's very hard to get in the backcountry, and it's hard to make a kid who's 7 years old understand that walking for 6 miles uphill, covering 2,000 vertical to get into a high mountain lake to go camping is a good thing, right?
Right.
And so my goal initially was to get goats to bait the people I love to come in the backcountry with me, so that not only they could handle their equipment, but goats are such a loving animal. They're like an attractor factor. And so my kids always wanted to go when the goats were going, and they didn't have to carry the packs and do all the work. So then I got that exquisite time with my kids. No screens, no distractions, nothing but the birds chirping every morning and the meals we cook and the conversations we have. And I've had thousands of those days in my life, and I'm so blessed. So goats brought me that. Now, if we fast forward, I own a ranch called Ripple Ranch here in Boise, Idaho. We're a full functioning raw goat dairy and breeding facility. We have about 40 goats on the property, and we raise about 200 babies a year because we're the number one source in the world for baby pack goats and well-bred stuff. We've changed goats back to their origins of more of a mountain goat, a leggy endurance athlete, as opposed to an animal that climbs to the top of a rock and hopes the predator can't get them. These goats are capable of covering miles and being athletes, and we've bred them to do that. And so that's kind of where I am today. Initially, when I started down the pack goat thing, I just got tired of answering the same question over and over. So I started making YouTube videos to answer people's questions. Then I started getting discontent with the gear that was in the industry, because basically what we did is we miniaturized horse tack and mule tack, stuck it on a goat and said that must work, and it doesn't. So I invented a completely different kind of saddle that's custom fit, made for a goat, has a yoke design, has a good britchin, double cinches. And now we have goats carrying a fitted saddle, and you can't believe what they're capable of. And you can't believe the depth of these animals in terms of intelligence. And Just know my mom and my family were all animal people. We've always had dogs, cats, squirrels, turtles, chipmunks, snakes, fish, all of it.
Everything.
That's it. And we did most of that out of an apartment when I was a kid. And I was raised really poor. We lived in an apartment. I had a single mom, and we had all the animals that I just listed, plus probably 20 more. We were animal people. So when I got exposed to goats, and I've been training hunting dogs since I was 12, I've been an animal person my whole life. I've never been around an animal till I got around a goat that was so complex, so smart, and such a beautiful animal to work alongside. I felt like I had been sold a bad bill of goods. You got to remember, we're the only continent in the world that has forgotten the value of a goat. Everybody else drinks goat meat, goat milk, eats goat meat, and utilizes goats for all their resources in terms of a stock animal. We're the only ones that rested on cattle and horses, pretty much. I mean, there are other countries that have that as a tradition, but go ahead.
Now, are you referring to all goat breeds, or are we talking just about alpine goat? Like, help me understand what types of goats we're talking about here.
That are most premium for packers?
Most premium for packers. What is that 100% your focus? Do you have different breeds?
No. So let me kind of first tell you my evolution. My first thing was people wanted to learn how to run pack goats, but then I was helping them get babies and they were killing them because they didn't know what to do. What people don't realize about goats is they're everything that I just said they were in amazing factor, but they're also were voted by top 100 homesteaders last year as the second most difficult animal to raise on a homestead out of 42 choices.
Really?
Okay. Yes. And those people weren't smoking crack. They were accurate. Goats are complex. Now, difficult? No. Complex? Yes. And can somebody teach you and you can duplicate it? Easily. But there's no resources in the goat world. Remember, we're living on a continent that forgot the value of a goat. Our vets aren't trained on them. The stock supply stores don't have them. Science doesn't study them because they're considered a disposable animal that you can buy for $40. So you throw one in the dead pile and you go get another one. Goats are the redheaded stepchild of the stock animal planet here in America. There's very little resources. You have to learn how to feed them. You have to learn how to vet them. You have to learn how to give them their vaccinations and castrations and trim their hooves and do all that stuff. And that's why we built all the courses. So the second stage of our company has been, okay, people want to run pack goats, but 80% of that pack goat's life is in the pasture. And if that's a miserable existence because they don't know how to take care of them, then I'm not doing my job. So I shifted my company's focus to trying to help people to learn how to raise goats. And unbeknownst, there is a massive amount of people that need this help. I mean, I just wrote my book and shipped it to 8 countries in the first month. So, I mean, it's a big thing. Nobody's teaching people how to help to raise goats. Nobody has systems to follow. Nobody has a big online course. There's a couple out there, but I'm the number one resource in the world to learn how to raise goats by watching courses.
Why? Okay, so not prevalent in the United States as they are throughout the world. Why is that? And what's the history of a pack goat? Because we've been looking for a long time, like you mentioned, getting out into the backcountry, getting down to the creek here and having them help us carry some of our stuff. And we really kind of were looking at llamas. And then I saw your content. I'm like, not a chance. And it's
Right.
very
Yeah.
it was immediately convincing, especially having had the experience of the Scottish Highlands. But what's that history and why is America set up the way that you just explained?
Wealth. We have the money. We can afford to pay for fertilizers and fuel to grow a monograzer so we can eat him. Remember, monograzing, eating one thing is not good for anything. And grass, cows just eat grass. Goats are very diverse in their diet. It's argued that they're the most diverse diet on the planet. They're browsers. So they eat a little bit of this, a little bit of that. 80% of their diet is actually roughage. Only 20% is for nutrition. Their stomach is so adept at digesting food that some articles of food will take up to 6 days to go through their digestive tract so they can work every little ounce of nutrition out of it. Plus, you think about the poop that comes out the back end, it's ready to go on the garden compost. They've done all the processing for you. It's beautiful compost, diverse compost. But why did we do it? Because we had lots of money. We could afford to grow pastures of grass that are monograzed and treat the soil poorly to do it, basically. And I'm not saying that cattle and horse people are wrong or bad for the environment or making poor choices. I'm not. I just think if somebody has a choice and you're choosing a backcountry animal that's a beast of burden, I've ran them all, and a goat is the best. You got to remember, my wife was, her family has 60 horses. She's been training horses for 40 years. We have a wild Mustang that she broke, 20 years ago. I mean, my wife is fucking ranchy. I mean, she gets after it. And when we choose to go into the backcountry, she never suggests that we should take the horses. Never. Because it's so much more of a dangerous, impactful, difficult animal to coexist with in the backcountry. Now on the farm or on the trail or something like that. But that video you watched, there's half the horse people out there that are like, you don't know horses and you blah, 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 all that different stuff. I love horses. I have a horse out there that I would cry for days if it died. I love Legend. He's an amazing horse. But there is no freaking way I'm going to take a screwdriver and go try to screw in a Phillips head, right? I'm not going to take a flat head and a Phillips head. And a horse in the backcountry, it's a Phillips head, and we need a flat head. We need something that's safe, that's easy to work with, that won't rack the trail. We don't have to pack in food for, on and on. And llamas are actually, I think, an equal, and donkeys are an equal, as if not good of choice. Primary problem is just expense. Those animals are very expensive. So now everything gets 4 times as much. So if you have the luxury of money, that may be another animal you choose. But a lot of people don't have the luxury of money. So goats have the barrier of entry cost-wise, which also makes it a part of the equation. But there's certainly choices with people who have unlimited money that could make to choose another stock animal and to buy really high-end breeding and good performance. I mean, there are great horses out there. There are. And there are great mules and there are great donkeys. But I find that goats, as a general rule, by far are an easier animal to work with. I'm not positive if I rabbit trailed away from your question, which was originally your question was, okay, well, why are we leaning on it? And I think I answered that with mostly the funds. But you have to remember that because of the lack of information that we have on goats, Facebook is not a great resource to ask questions on how to raise them. You'll get 5 arguments and 20 people giving you different information, right? It's just super confusing. If you go to the stock supply store, I guarantee you, please do not get advice at a stock supply store on how to take care of a goat. They don't know. Your neighbor most likely doesn't know. I would say of people who raise goats in America, the people who are truly efficient and proficient at raising goats is about 30%. The rest of them are kind of getting by. And when you see the difference between a goat that's well taken care of and see his performance measured by how many miles he can do, because I have a direct measurement, right? I mean, our only measurement in agriculture is how much milk do they make, how many babies do they have, how much weight gain do they have. But I actually get to see an animal exert itself and run out of gas based on how healthy he is. And so I get these really interesting tests I get to do. In fact, it's one of the best ways I discovered how does produce milk is that I took them into the backcountry, and literally one day in the backcountry of exerting themselves and eating natural forage, a doe's milk production will drop by 75 to 50% on the first day and then hold there. And it's purely about, energy in, energy out. So I could actually measure it. How did that affect that doe to have to walk that trail? How much milk did she make less? How's this forage here? How's she producing? Is she continuing to fall off? And if you think about it, while we're mentioning that to your audience, one of the most proficient and excellent, especially in the West, bug out tool is a pack of goats. Because I don't think if the shit hits the fan, people are going to be safe in their overland rigs unless they get way out. But I know I will be safe camped remotely off a trail on a high mountain lake that doesn't have a trail to it. I can make a living there. As long as I don't have to go out midwinter, I can make a living.
Sounds so good. So you mentioned difficulties
Mm,
in how they're different. Can you kind of branch out what that looks like for someone like
yeah,
me getting started? What am I going to see?
yeah.
What are the issues? What do I have to consider?
Great question. So, one of the greatest misunderstandings about goats is that they eat everything. They're actually one of the most sophisticated and exacting palates on the planet. They select plants based on ripeness. They select plants based on phosphorus and calcium ratio. They have one of the most intuitive palates on the planet to nourish themselves. So then, when we stick them in a fence, we don't give them in a variety, and they're eating one thing, which is hay. We have to be very mindful that we're taking them out of their normal eating system. So one of the things you have to track is the weather, and I'll tell you the main trouble spots. Number one is nutrition. So learning how to feed goats is very important. Everybody can rest on their laurels if they just feed grass hay. Grass hay is what you want to feed to a goat, not alfalfa.
Hmm.
Alfalfa is a very hot form of feed. Now, when I say that to you, you should know I feed all my does alfalfa. Why? Because that does can take that, but wethers can't. And you're going to be packing with wethers. So you're going to probably, do you know what a wether is? That's a castrated
No.
male goat. Okay, it's a
Okay.
castrated male goat. I'm sorry about that. So a castrated male goat has particular nutritional needs because what they form is basically a urinary tract stone. If they don't have the right phosphorus to calcium ratio in their forage, then they will develop bladder stones, and those bladder stones will go up their urethra, block the penis, and then the bladder explodes over a 2 to 3 day period, and it's a miserable death. And a lot of people kill their goats because they'll feed too hot a feed on calcium or phosphorus. And the solution is very simple. You go down, you buy your hay, you grab a handful of it, you stick it into a bag, you send it to Ward Laboratories, and they'll tell you exactly what your phosphorus to calcium ratio is. And now you know you're golden. The phosphorus to calcium ratio to feed to wethers is 3 to 1. So you want 3 parts of calcium to 1 part of phosphorus. Grass hay is naturally that. That's why we pick it. So you feed wethers grass hay. The urinary tract stones that does develop exactly the same way don't affect them as much because they have a big urethra. Think about the dribble that comes out of a goat's penis versus the gusher that comes out of a goat's vagina. So they have plenty of room to push out those stones. So we're not worried about stones with does. So we pound them with that high protein alfalfa feed because it helps them grow babies and make milk, which are both massive calcium draws. So we have to be conscientious to feed girls different than boys. So do you see that? So
Yeah.
there's
Is
a
the
level of
only
complexity.
Yeah, absolutely. Does that mean that you've got to have them segregated? You've got to have a fence between them, or how do they not
No,
eat each
if you're
other's?
yeah, if you're gonna so you should just know as goat owners, are you planning on milkers as well?
That's another question I have, but we would love that. Yes.
Okay. And make sure you have me geek out on the nutritional value of goat milk and speak to you about milking because that's a whole nother subject, right? But if we stick primarily to just owning goats, if you're going to run milkers, they have a vulnerable part on their body. It's an udder, right? And goats love to hook each other underneath the belly. And so a lot of times what we'll do in my herd is I'll separate my does and my wethers. The reason I separate my wethers is just to eliminate another chance at aggression. Does pound on each other too, and they'll coexist fine. And my wethers will coexist fine. I would just have to feed my whole for herd grass hay, and then my milk production would drop off a little bit because grass hay doesn't have the protein content that alfalfa does. Good high grade dairy grade alfalfa will be 18 to as much as 24% protein. Really high grade grass hay struggles to be 10 or 12. So and goats need above 8. So you have to buy high grade, kind of horse grade grass hay. And I'm specifically looking for a dirty farmer. When I call it a dirty farmer, he's got weeds, he's got old stuff in there. It's an old pasture that has 7 different varieties. I like a lot of our area has some medicinal plants that go into the milk and make it more medicinal. So I select hay based on that. The other 2 factors that you really have to be aware of with goats, one of the number one killers is parasites. And so where do you live?
6,000 feet, northern Colorado.
Okay, so you'll never have an issue with parasites. You won't have the number one issue that everybody down south has. Because what happens when parasites in a goat happen, they poop them out. That's part of the gestation period, right? So they get pooped out, then they get re-eaten in a larval form, and then they reinfect themselves. Goats, as a general rule, you have to remember, will build a parasite load based on the fact that they're re-eating their own poop, right? They are, no matter what you try to do. They're going to get into the feeder. They're going to pick a little piece of grass off the ground and get a little larva in them or whatever. The tighter you house goats and the more you put in a smaller area, the more problem you're going to have with parasites. Now, the problem they have down south is that the ground never freezes. And because the ground never freezes, they don't kill all the parasite loads in the ground. Your place at 6,000 feet will kill every parasite in the ground every single season. You get to start from scratch. The people down south that don't get a freeze, their worm load just builds and builds and builds and builds. Okay. So by comparison, in Texas, they got to treat their goats for parasites once every 2 months religiously. Up here, we don't test unless we test their poop, see that there's a problem, and then we treat. We never treat goats unless we know there's a problem with parasites. And up north, we just don't have the problems. So that's learning about parasites is going to be another very important thing. There's one key parasite that kills a lot of goats. It's called the stomach worm or the barber pole worm. And it's almost always from too tight of quarters or overgrazing your land. With grazing, with goats, you always want to rotate your pastures every 21 days, because if you don't rotate every 21 days, now that barber pole worm larva will crawl up onto the top of the grass stalk and they'll so infect themselves, their immune system can't keep up with it, and then they'll become very anemic. There's two kinds of parasites. There's bloodsuckers and there's food eaters. The stomach worm is a bloodsucker. And so what it does is sow a mass in their body. It makes them super anemic, drops their red blood cell count. They start getting super weak. And if you don't treat them quickly, they will die of it. So, but you won't have as many issues with parasites up where you live. So nutrition, parasites, and those are going to be, the two primary concerns. The remaining are pretty simple. They're just learning things like number one threat to your goats is your neighbor's dog. Neighbors' dogs kill goats all the time, especially when they're babies. It's the whole rabbit, I'm going to chase it, it runs, predator instinct clicks in, and all of a sudden your friendly Labrador just killed your neighbor's goat, right? It happens a lot. So you got to kind of watch that. But yeah, that's the two things, man. The whole urinary calculi, calcium and phosphorus ratio is all based on feed. So when I line out your feed system, I eliminate the ability for you to have to worry about urinary calculi. But if nobody teaches you that feeding system, then you're in trouble. The last component with goats that's critical to their immune system and their well-being is mineral. They are more reliant on mineral than most other animals. You really need to have a good source of mineral, loose mineral that they're eating a lot, because it's the foundation of their immune system. Keep their immune system healthy, you have no problems with parasites, and you keep them the proper calcium to phosphorus ratio and test your hay, bam, you're off and running year one. You don't have to turn your system.
Is that the same as the blue buckets with minerals for cattle, or is it something different?
Good question. So traditionally, most animals are able to get their mineral licking off of a block or what you're describing in that way. Goats specifically need what's called loose mineral, which is bagged mineral poured into an open container so they can just lick it. And the theory is dual fold. Number one is when you're feeding wethers and they eat a whole bunch of salt, what's the first thing you do after you eat salt? You drink water. And when you drink water, you dilute your urine. And when you have diluted urine, you don't develop stones. So that's a double counteracting. It's really important to have a constant, untappable, unchecked source of mineral that they can eat, and they will self-regulate it on their own. They won't overeat it. They won't undereat it. They'll get what they need. But it's critical to have your mineral right, and a lot of people don't realize that. If you put a block out there, like 90% of people would, just sensically thinking, what happens is they can't get enough salt, so they'll try to chew on it, and they'll wear their teeth down. So a goat can't get enough salt off a block to get them taken care of, and that's, again, common sense. Now that you know it. But if you did it the wrong way for 2 years, now all of a sudden you're going to have a parasite problem. You're going to start killing your goats. So are you starting to connect? I mean, it really only takes a little bit of instruction to learn the system to raise goats really well. But if you don't, they're literally dying on you. They're not just getting sick, they're dying. And that's kind of what I tell people. I say, the number one thing I see people do wrong with goats is not what saddle they buy or pack goats or anything. Goats in general, the largest problem people have is they don't educate themselves and they assume they're like a dog. Throw a piece of food out there, they're going to be great. If you do that, you're going to kill your goats every time, eventually, because you're not doing it right. So that's where my course is. I always tell people, if you take every single course I've ever made, every single one, you'll still spend less than one vet visit at your ranch. And I guarantee you, I'm going to save you that vet visit. So for me, people are actually choosing to lose money to not educate themselves on goats because the vets are freaking expensive. And there's not many that know goats. You'll try to call in your area and get a vet that'll come out to your farm to look at a goat. It's 1 out of 15. It's really hard to find a vet. And the other thing about a vet that comes to your farm, every large animal vet in the United States only spent 1 week on goats. 1 week, 5 days. They spent 5 days of learning about goats. So they are just like us. When they show up, they have a better spread of the knowledge of the chemicals and symptoms. And of course, they have more universal information. But in terms of what they know about goats, man, if you take one of my courses, you're going to know about what they know about goats. I mean, it's just the reality of it.
Yeah, it seems great. So going back to the minerals real quick,
Yeah.
the way you were explaining it, so it's not the bucket, it's not necessarily the block. It is like a granular that's poured into something, or can you kind of paint a picture of what that looks like for everybody?
Yeah, you just buy a 50-pound. The nice part about minerals, it's super cheap. 50-pound bag is $20. And what I do is instead of putting it in a container, I actually put it in it's in all my videos and all my courses. You actually make a gravity feeder and you make it out of a sewer cleanup that you can buy at Home Depot. So it's a little sewer cleanup pipe. You put the cap on the end. The sewer cleanup comes out this way. This is where they access the mineral. And then you have a big, long vertical tube that's 4 inches wide, so you can keep your goats in
Just a
mineral
4-inch
for 3
PVC.
months. Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
it's
That's
called
simple.
a creep feeder or a gravity feeder. It just keeps dropping down the mineral as they do it, and they know to go over and get it.
And you've got that underneath a roof, I'm
In my
guessing.
shelter. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And that's something you should know too. Most people misunderstand 2 things about taking care of goats. Number one is, how much space do they need? Goats don't need a lot of space. They can get by in a small space. Overcrowding is a concern, but they don't need space to run, especially during the winter. During the winter, they're going to go from their shelter to the food to the water. That's it. They aren't going to walk out in your fields. They aren't going to spend any time out there. So the way I've set up my homestead is I have one small area where I protect the goats, all the goats on the whole ranch every night with my livestock guardian dogs. I have 2 Anatolian shepherds. I live right in the middle of mule deer wintering range. So we get all the predators, cougars, wears, bears, wolves, everything are around our ranch every day. And I'll tell you, the first day that I slept with a livestock guardian dog in my pasture is the first good night's sleep I got with goats living here. It was a godsend. Livestock guardian dogs are worth their weight in gold in terms of just peace and mind, right? They do their job really well. But
Are they confined to the same area, the same fencing? You don't
That's
have a
correct.
spot where they can like get out and go around the fence and come back in, or they're in exactly the same living quarters as all of the goats.
That's correct. Yeah. The only time I bring them out of that area is to feed them, because the goats will compete with them for the food. Our dogs are both scared of goats. So those goats will pound on those dogs regularly. It's the saddest thing, because those dogs protect them every night, but those goats are not nice to those dogs. They're finally used to them. They let them lay around. They don't hassle them, stuff like that. But if a goat gets a chance to whack, I probably hear Storm, and he's a 150-pound Anatolian that would rip anything to shreds. I probably hear him yelp once a day out there. Poor guy.
Oh, because he's getting stepped on or kicked or something.
Yeah, he's not kicked. They'll horn him. They'll walk past him and give him a little, sucker punch. And that's just how they are. That's kind of goats are not nice to each other. They're super nice to you, but man, I mean, there's no chivalry in goats, and there's no friends in goats. There's comrades. There's people that they lay next to, but the two siblings that were raised together, brother and sister, their whole lives, that boy will pound the shit out of that girl for food if he gets a chance. I mean, he just will. There is no alliances in goats. It's survival of the fittest. The pasture is all about who's toughest. There's a saying in goats that there's only one goat that doesn't get his ass kicked every day, and that's the alpha. That's the leader. He's the only one. Everybody else gets pounded, and it just happens.
Are there two alphas? You're an alpha, and then there's also an actual goat alpha, or is that when you're away? Are they a little bit more aggressive towards each other?
Yeah. So, it seems to be there's some guy that did a documentary that defined alpha. So it seems to be the collective consciousness out there thinks that alpha is the wrong word for the leader of a goat herd. So I'm going to try to that's what I've always used it as a term. So let's just use alpha so we understand that, or leader. What I actually find is that there are goats that are leaders in different capacity. I have goats that'll lead on the trail that are like my trail alpha. I have goats that will lead in the pasture and that are my pasture alpha. And then it's almost always a different goat that's my breeding alpha. And so when I put a doe that's in heat, these wethers still all pick her. They still all fight over her. They hang out around her. They want to breed her, but they don't have the equipment. But who wins the battle. And it's almost always a different goat than the one who usually runs the show. It's a trippy thing. So they have a pretty complex infrastructure, and they have different things they rise to the occasion for. Like, I had an alpha named Thorn for years and years. He was gentle. He wouldn't be mean to other goats, anything like that. You didn't even know he's the alpha, except for people quietly walked out of the way when he came to the feeder. He never enforced himself. He never was aggressive. But when I put a doe out there and wanted to figure out who really run that pasture, it was Thorn. So it's pretty interesting how their infrastructure works. And this is another thing you and other goat owners need to know. You cannot ever manhandle your goats. That means you can't lay your hands on them, punch them, kick them, reprimand them, do those things. Not because they're a sentient being and they deserve the respect, which they do. But other side is, in goat world, as soon as you become somebody who will pound on them, then you become fair game in the circle, right? So if you rough them up, that's how people, how all those people all remember that one goat that whacked them or cheap shotted them from behind, or that the neighbor told them to be scared of, or whatever. Everybody's got this story about a goat that scared them one time in their life. Almost all those goats were just improperly handled. There's not many animals, including a horse, that you can't reprimand physically and they don't learn the lesson. The goats learn the lesson, but then they start assuming that humans are pound worthy. And what they'll do is they'll pick on little humans. So they'll pick on kids and they'll pick on women. And so the other thing you can't really do is play aggressively with them. Goats can't separate play and aggression. It gets to a point where it's okay to horn dad. And as soon as they think it's okay to horn dad, then that means I'm going to be able to hold myself. But when my little kid walks in the pen, all of a sudden everybody's got their hackles up and it's like, who's that? And all that stuff. If you maintain those kind of knowledge of goats and how to work with them, your life will be so much more beautiful in coexistence. So loving.
Okay. So if you've got an aggressive goat and you can't grab its horns, you can't like hold it in a position or whatever, what's the methodology of getting that, that loving goat back rather than that aggressive goat when you come in?
Super good question. The answer is either burgers, okay, because I don't deal with an aggressive goat on my ranch. I'm going to turn them into food. They have another role. They can be food. They can be somebody else's weed eater. They can be somebody else's horse companion. But as soon as they come into aggression, that means that's a goat that's not going to be great to have around young human beings the rest of his life. And so I always feel dutiful to turn that one into goat tacos. The other side is there is a one ditch effort. There's two there, and it's actually two. And I was told this early in my goating life by an old man in Kansas, and it's held true forever, is that when you catch those goats when they're young, the goats that just all of a sudden went from, wow, he's super kind, to now all of a sudden he's posturing at me. He's horning the hay out of my hands when I'm walking out to the pen. He's getting too close to me. He's thrown his head at me once. The first sign of that behavior, what we do is we flip them on their back. We stand over them And then we just let them sit there for about 10 minutes. And I have a video that shows you how to do it. It's called flipping a goat. What I usually find is about 50% of the goats that I try to correct with that will fully correct in 1 or 2 flips.
Wow.
If I'm going to do more flips than that, then he's a lost cause. So I'll give 1 or 2 flips to a goat to have an opportunity to reestablish himself. And I'm not using it as a reprimand. I'm using it as a dominance tool. So I'm saying, hey, dude, you don't run this show. We do. And you won't believe how many of them just flip the coin immediately. You never see that behavior again. But if he gets back up and does the same thing again, that's a burger goat. So that's been my experience.
Let's go into that a little bit. My view of having these goats is multifunctional and utility. So it's the utility of bringing them into the backcountry, helping me around the property here, the milk, the companionship, and then also the food storage. So I know that, and you probably deal with this a lot. That's hard to hear. We're also going to be getting in. We've got chickens. We've had a lot of experience. One of the things that we're also going to be doing is eventually is meat rabbits. But that process for a lot of people understand it. They can grasp it. A lot of others that their emotions are a little bit different. But let's go through the process of making burgers. What are the initial steps? How does that process look? Are you bringing it to a processor? Are you doing it yourself?
So I've been butchering my own meat for my whole life with elk, right? So I just butcher my own goats as well. And the one thing about butchering an old goat, you got to remember American palates are used to eating babies. We eat baby chicken, we eat baby cows, we eat baby lambs. We don't eat any adult animals anymore, right? So we think that tough meat means bad meat. It's just, it's an older animal. So generally as a rule, I follow in the human norm of liking nice tender steaks to chew on. So when I'm butchering an adult goat, the process is I had an 80-year-old woman teach me how to put a goat down one time. It was the sweetest thing. She was telling me about it as she was eating the last goat she was putting down, by the way. It was pretty cool. She was salty. I loved her. But anyway, she said basically what she does is she puts down a grain bucket because every goat loves grain. So they get their last bite. Right. I think it's a kind thing to do. So I'll give them a bucket of grain. They stick their head down in the grain and they're just milling around in there. I let them eat for a little bit. And then the best place to shoot a goat is right in the back of the head. So when their head's down in the bucket, you put the pistol right just 2 inches back from the top of the horn and down. You can't go in this way because their skull's too thick. You'll flatten out the bullet right on the source. You can go in the temple. I have videos that show you how to put down a goat. So they're all on my YouTube channel. You either want to put it 2 inches in front of the ear hole or you want to put it right in the back of the head, like 2 inches right behind the horns, because that's where you can get a 22 or a 380 into the skull. Once they go down and they go down instantly, their legs just come out from underneath them. They're gone. They're no longer there. And then I skin them and butcher them. Usually what I do with these goats that are older is I like canned meat. So we'll just can the whole goat. So we'll cube his whole body up. We'll can him. And then that gives us things to give other people. And it also gives us 5 years of shelf life with no refrigeration. You know, it's nice to have 40 jars of meat sitting in the cupboard. And we eat it regularly. It's a soup. Have you canned meat?
Yes.
It's delicious. It's delicious.
Let's run through that because I know there are a lot of individuals and a lot of the things that we talk about on this podcast and in the content that I produce is longevity or something that you can have on hand that's going to last 3, 5, 10, 20 years. We've got freeze drying, we've got dehydrating, we've got canning, but let's go through the canning process. So now you've got that meat and you're doing this on the kitchen table, on the dining room table.
Yeah,
let's just kind of run through the logistics of it.
Yeah, to make it, and for your followers, sake, just know I'm a very thrifty guy. So I'm always looking for the affordable way to do things. That's just my nature. So what I did is I found 2 pressure cookers that I bought from an old lady at a yard sale for $20 a piece. And they were probably 30 years old and they're still working today. I've been using them for 10 years. And I set it on the shelf and I watch a little YouTube video every time to remind me what the temperatures are and what the duration is and what I need to throw in the jar. And it's as simple as easy. It's about an hour on the stove. It boils inside, you test the little lids, you're ready to go, and you got canned meat. And I like to add salt. I don't like to add flavoring, things like barbecue sauce or seasonings or that thing. I just want the base of fall apart, delicious, salty meat with all that goodness in there of the collagen and everything else that goes. Because basically, the canning process, for those that don't know, liquefies every form of connective tissue and turns it into pure collagen. So when you think back in your days of seeing Spam, that gooey, disgusting, snotty looking stuff, that's basically liquidized collagen. It's super good for you. So that canned meat, what we use it for is a base for tacos, any soups that we build. We always just put a canned meat in there, mostly for the juicy, delicious, salty broth too. So it's a great soup base. It's a quick meal, super simple. We do a little thing where we just throw a canned meat in with potatoes, and it's dinner in 5 minutes, and then we're back out doing chores. So did that answer your question about kind of the process?
Yeah. Let's go through can size and how much yield.
So I just use the small canning jars, and I don't know if I'm sophisticated enough to answer your yield question. What do you mean by yield? I'm sorry. How many do I get off a goat?
How many pounds we're getting off of goat? How are we utilizing the bones? What are you doing more with that? Are you making bone broth? Are you able to give that to your dogs?
I prefer.
What does that look like?
Yeah, because bone broth out of these uh, elk, deer, goats, those sorts of things, the actual marrow, in my opinion, has a super gamey flavor. Mm-hmm. I get way better bone marrow out of chickens. That's more palatable to me. So I choose, and I raise
a little better when you're making it too.
It does. Yeah. I just, I'd rather give those to my dogs. I was just talking with my wife about it the other day. I was like, I've never thought about feeding the dogs, but I just saw this statistic the other day. Do you know the average golden retriever used to live 16 years and now it lives 9?
Yes.
And that's all because of this preserved BS food that we're giving our dogs too. So I thought about it the other day. I was like, honey, we constantly kvetch because we have goats that we love, right? I mean, here's the part that you're not counting on, Rob. You will love these goats almost as much as your dog, if not more. They have so much personality, and when you milk a goat on the stand, and especially if you're hand milking, whether you're hand milking or machine milking, but most people start off hand milking, there is a benevolent connection that happens there. You'll be sitting milking a goat, and you'll like think, I'm supposed to be here. It was an animal that we were supposed to coexist with. And when you start working with a doe and she's so sweet and grateful that you took her milk and you gave her some grain and she's happy to see you every time, you have these morning and evening interactions with her that are, beautiful. They're beautiful. This is an animal that we're working with. And that's the part that you aren't counting on that will show up. You'll love these buggers. They're just the kindest animals. They're so fun to be around. They're like watching goat TV out my window is half my entertainment during the day, watching them play. And yeah, and you should know, I'm not just a goat nerd. I'm an animal nerd. And goats are just incredibly unique in intellect, in complexity, in like all the different ways that make a pet good. Goats are one of the best pets on the planet. I get all kinds of criticism. I get cats and dogs and all that stuff. They're a better pet than a dog. They're lower maintenance. They're easier to love on. You don't have to do as many things as you do to make their way. You can just go out and give a goat love and make sure they get some hay a couple of times a day. And that's your interaction. I mean, and they're happy with it. So it's not like you know how those people that feel like they have to walk their dog because it's like a duty. Well, goats don't have like that much duty to them. They exist really well in the pasture and love it when you come see them, but it's not like they're calling for you out in the pasture all day long. But a dog would. They'd whine and, hey, I need interaction. Goats, they kind of do great on their own, and they do great when you're there. It's bitching. It's easy.
I love it. And let's go into the livestock guardian dogs and their relationship a little bit more with the goats. So you're saying in most environments like that we live in, having livestock guardian dogs is not only good, but it's essential. Could you do the same with a donkey? How would a donkey work with the goats? How do you look at these two livestock guardian dogs and go, could I get away with just having one, or is that just not fair to that dog?
No, no. I mean, Storm did well on his own. He did. He found companionship in the goats and the couple that were nice to him. But he really thrived when we put another dog out there with him. He did okay as one.
Define thrived. What are you referring to?
Playing. Playing. I mean, when an animal plays, he's happy and he's well fed and he's carefree. When I look out there, when Storm was by himself, he wasn't playing. Now that we got another dog out there with him, they play all the time, so I would say that's thriving. And, I have the financial luxury to feed another dog. But those livestock guardian dogs are expensive to feed and they don't live very long. I mean, your base level cost. I rescued one and bought another puppy. I paid $600 for the puppy because I wasn't interested in the breeding. And that was a female. And then I got the male. I rescued him. I got him for free. So here's something you need to know about livestock guardian dogs. And you asked me the question of 1 versus 2. Is it the only choice? No. There's choices of elaborate fencing to keep predators out. But that's not for sure. And one event can kill them all. And I have seen that system not work more than once. And that system is you put an electric fence at about nose height on the outside. So you put an electric wire because a predator will come up and try to kind of get a sense of the place. If you give him a chance to shock himself, he probably will right there at the fence. Then if he goes, that's no big deal, then you have to create a height and you want an electric up above, and then you want another one higher because a cougar can jump 8-9 feet. You're never going to build an 8-foot tall fence, right? So that's where when you start talking about the extra fencing, the only other choice you're going to have to keep your goats protected at night, which is your primary purpose. The predators don't come during the day, even when they're foraging. Most times I've never had issue, and I haven't had other people have issue. But the other way is to lock your goats up at night. So for you to have a closed in barn that they go in and they get put in every night. Now, the way I think about things, you should know this about me. I'm pretty much like an undiagnosed Asperger guy. It's hard for me to be honest about that, but I've gotten better at it because I feel like people will think they need to treat me different. But so for me, I think one of my kind of quote unquote savant things that I hold in my body is that I am a master of efficiency. I do not waste a moment ever. I see time as my most valuable commodity. I can either be working or doing things that are better.
So you get a lot done.
I do. Yeah, I'm a super doer, which makes me really hard to live with because nobody else quite does it like that. And I always feel like it's fucking unfair and I get mad and resentful and grumbly about it. I'm like, I'm out here doing all the work and what are you doing? So I certainly struggle with that. But what I will tell you, my efficiency bent is really helpful for people looking on homesteads because it's my operating mechanism. My operating mechanism is efficiency, and livestock guardian dogs were more efficient. The amount of time and energy I had to put out versus buying 2 dogs and having them do their job, my only offset was the care of those dogs and the feeding of those dogs versus a fence that I would have to go to bed feeling worried about every night.
Sure.
So for me, go ahead.
I want to know exactly what's the budget? Let's just say one livestock guardian dog. What's the budget? What are you feeding them, or what do you believe is the optimal diet for them?
If I went back and did it again, you know what I'd do is I'd buy a female because number one, they're smaller, right? I mean, I think the muchissimo side of men want a bigger dog, but he's just bigger and he's going to die. I mean, these big dogs die fast. So the bigger they are, the quick.
10 years?
They're going to start breaking down to 8, 7, stuff like that. So, so these guys are, and I haven't raised one through lifespan. So I'm speaking based on the knowledge of the actual breed itself rather than my experience. I've only had livestock guardian dogs now for 4 years.
Okay.
And I would get a female and I would rescue one. So I didn't have the upfront expenses. And then I also didn't have to gauge their temperament because the temperament is critical on these dogs. You should know that livestock guardian dogs are almost the same as goats. If you go ask a question on the livestock guardian dog forum, you're going to get 20 people telling you what a schmuck you are, and then 20 other people giving you different advice. It's just a horrible place to get advice because people are so passionate, I think. If I were to redo it again, I would probably buy a female, and I would buy an adult female, and I would specifically be looking for an adult female that's
adult female being what age?
1 or 2.
Okay.
Yeah. The main thing I want to do is be able to gauge their adult temperament. And here's why. Because Anatolians and livestock guardian dogs in general, a large percentage of them are aggressive towards human beings. And I don't want a livestock guardian dog on my farm, because I have so many visitors, that's aggressive ever towards a human being. Now, somebody who wants to protect their land from human beings and whatever, okay. So what those people do is they literally buy them as puppies. They set them out in their goat herd, and they never pet them. So they turn them into a pure utility animal. They don't want them domesticated. They want them feral. They want them running big country, doing their job, and it's natural for them to do it. But then you got to think about it. What happens when that dog gets hurt? What happens when you got to put it in a kennel and try to take it to the vet, and they're trying to muzzle it because it's trying to kick their ass? I mean, I don't think there's many applications in the human being condition where it makes sense to have a dog that will kill another human being in your possession. And a livestock guardian dog can definitely kill a human being. They are the reason I call Storm Storm. If I yell at him, he would roll over on his belly right now and be scared of me. They're very soft. But when you get something in front of them, holy mackerel. I saw him attack a dog one time, and I've just never seen anything like it. I called him off of it.
Who is that? Yeah.
It was my buddy's dog. My buddy brought his dog over, and Trisha, by mistake, let Storm out to come visit with us. We never do that. And all of a sudden, those dogs got into a fight. I bet you it was 1.5 seconds at most that he was on that dog, and he grounded and pounded him. He grabbed him with, like, they have these big claws, like bear claws. They got different claws, and he grabbed that dog and just shoved it to the ground and got on him. And then I yelled, "Storm," and he came off. So he was only on him for like a second and a half. That dog had a bite here, a bite here, a bite here, a bite here. I mean, I didn't even
If you're listening, you saying neck and head.
Right. Yeah. And honestly, I have never seen. I actually thought he didn't bite him at all. I thought
so fast.
Yeah, I was blown away. So these guys are capable of big, and they can run down coyotes. They're way faster than you think they are. So
are coyotes a concern even with goats?
Oh, for sure. Especially with juveniles, especially with does. They'll come in and chew their udders off. They'll do all kinds of things. Coyotes are certainly a concern.
Why don't you rank that really quick? Like if we've got coyotes, if we've got mountain lion, like what would be your top
bears?
3, I guess?
Bears is
black
number
bears?
1. Yeah, because they're bold, right? But black bears don't have a barometer in them like a cougar does. A cougar tells himself every time he has to be careful or he's going to get hurt and die. A bear doesn't have as much concern for his well-being because he can take care of himself better. So a bear will bumble into a situation and figure it out. A cougar will calculate for 2 weeks and decide the weak point and then move in. And he's risk adverse. He's trying to protect himself. Can I kill something without being hurt? And you have to understand the mechanism of a livestock guardian dog. Here's another thing to know. My dogs have not killed one animal since I've lived here in 3 years. Not one. Not even a skunk.
Because of their bark.
Because of their bark. And that's what people need to understand. These dogs bark their ass off all night long. They are not a good pet at all. Not even close. I can't even imagine having them as a pet. They have a huge loud bark, and they're bred to bark to basically create a presence around the perimeter. They'll bark straight for like 2 hours every night around the perimeter. They'll just bark there, and they create such a presence. All the predators like, I ain't going down there. There's 2 big ass dogs. I guess I'm going to make a pass on that one and go to the next spot. So we never have issues just because of their presence.
I want to go back real quick. If you've got this layout, if you can help me visualize the layout of one where they're sleeping at night. So how big
Mm.
does that area need to be? Do you have to try to avoid uh, corners where the goats that are getting harassed or bullied that they can get out of? Do I have to think about things like that in relation to their, you know, some of the goats being more aggressive and then the smaller goats always feeling like they have to run and hide so they won't even sleep in the right place?
Yeah, so making enough available shelter, feeders, water, and bedding access is really important based on the number of goats you have, because they will bully each other out of those shelters. Now, as far as the dogs go, those Anatolian shepherds could lay out in 15 degrees below zero on a snowbank in a snowstorm and act like they're on the beach. They're never cold. They have the coats that are unbelievable. So I'm never worried about that side. But to answer your question, both my dogs bed down with the does in their pen, and they just bed down in the straw with the rest of them. And, you know, they get along well enough to where that now is fine. So I don't make any considerations for how the dogs live with the goats. They just figure out their way, and yours will too. And I have dog houses out there for them, but they won't go in them, because if they're in there and another goat, because the goats like to go in the dog's house. So if the goat comes in there, he's going to beat him out of there. And now he's in a blind corner, just like you were saying, or a dead end. But the answer to your question is very intuitive. And that's a good question. Almost no one would have thought of that. So I want to acknowledge you. Is dead ends in a goat pen are really bad. And it's mainly when you're mixing ages. So when you get a little juvenile in there that's like 4 or 5 months old and he's running around and one of those big adults backs him into a corner, they will pound them. They will keep pounding them. I had a goat one time get caught in a feeder. He had his hoof caught up, and my biggest goat was literally, I look outside and he's just bashing him one after another, and couldn't get away, because goats have this weird thing that as soon as a goat is injured or weak, then everybody picks on him. So when you get a sick goat, you need isolation pens where you can go put him somewhere else, because goats have this crazy sense of weakness, and they don't let anybody slide on being weak. They'll go after them. So no dead ends, and kind of watching out. Now, I realize that if you just heard that, you probably thought, oh my God, plus how Mark's talking about these goats are awful on each other. To give you a barometer with proper
so are
care,
chickens.
right? Yeah, chickens are brutal too. It's true.
Yeah, if you watch chickens, you're like, oh, I'd never want to be a chicken in that environment. You know,
That's
every time
right.
they're turning around, they're pecking at each other, and they're jerks.
Yeah,
Turkeys
they are
worse.
Yeah. So goats are pretty similar. It's the same thing. So I don't want to over caution people on that, but it's the same thing with chickens. You give them enough roost so they can stay each other and they don't pick on each other on the roost at night. Same stuff. So yeah, yes, we avoid dead ends, to answer your question.
Okay, so then the segregation of these animals. Help me understand that again, because I'm a little confused. If we've got, you call them wethers?
Wethers are a castrated male goat. A buck
In a non-castrated goat is a billy. Or
a buck, actually.
It's a buck.
Yeah,
So
it's
what's
a buck
a billy?
and a doe. Well, a billy is a human made-up word for an intact male goat. Nobody in the goat world calls him a billy.
Okay.
I mean, they do it's buck. It's buck and doe.
Buck. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you have any bucks?
So that's a great question. So let me answer your segregation.
Okay.
I never segregated my goats till I ended up with a bunch. The only reason I
define bunch and what you were before. Are we talking 5 and then 25?
Yeah, no, I had a herd of 7 packers and 2 does. They all lived together. I never separated them. They did great. They coexisted. I packed with them, all that different stuff. But
and
now
you never
I have
packed
20
with does.
I don't, because they're inferior packers. They're inefficient. Okay. I would rather bring in a doe without weight and just have her bring her udder, because now she's making 2,200 calories for me per day in the backcountry out of grass.
Didn't think of that. Okay, so you're just drinking that raw goat's milk on the trail at 11,000 feet next to a mountain lake. I mean, what is getting better than that? That is like a dream come true.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's rad. Wait till you taste a coffee. Wait till you make an instant coffee in camp over
Oh,
a
come
campfire and
on.
then latte it with a goat twist. It's awesome. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Please.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so go ahead.
So,
Go what? Yeah, that dynamic of having those bucks.
okay.
And do you
So,
have them?
yeah. So there's two ways to kind of have a breeding population. And something that people misunderstand that makes goats really unique is you can breed them once and milk them the rest of their lives. They don't have to have another kid. Now
Really?
yeah. They're one of the few goats. They're one of the few animals that you can have one baby and milk them the rest of their life
But hold
without
on,
them
real quick
drying out.
question on that. And I'm sorry to interrupt you. Alpine goats don't. So this is an uneducated statement. That's a question. Alpine goats don't produce as much milk as other breeds.
Good question. So the dairy goats and the breeds are variant more on genetics than they are the breed. Now, the larger the goat, the larger the udder, right? So we're breeding some really large goats. The largest goat is called a Saanen or a sable. And they're a very gentle breed. They don't translate super well into packers because they're so gentle, but they're a great homestead goat and they make a ton of milk. Don't forget these high production dairy goat milkers can make between 2 and 3 gallons a day, and the average is 1 to 1.4.
With never having had what do you call it, a kid?
No, that I would say that's that's freshening that's freshening milk production. You got to remember over time. So an udder is a supply and demand machine. The more demand it has, the more supply it's going to make to meet the demand, as long as it doesn't overtake the biological ability to make milk and enough nutrition to do it. Right. So they will make more if you take more. It's a natural mechanism to feeding a baby goat as it grows. It needs less in the beginning and they need more production as they're getting close to weaning weight. So these goats will build their production over about the first 2 or 3 months. Then it's dependent on how good of a milker you are. How good are you at stripping out the teats of all the last little milk so it doesn't have any milk in there? The body wants to produce more for you the next time, and then you're milking it all out again. So a person who learns how to milk well learns how to what we call in the milking world stripping. So when you're stripping the last little bit of milk out of that udder and spending the time to do that, you're making that udder more productive. The better you are at that over time, the more production you're going to get over time. And eventually you'll end up getting down to where you're like, man, I'm only getting a pint of milk. 2 years ago when I was milking her when we had babies, it was 1.5 gallons. Now all you got to do is get her pregnant again and she'll be back at that 1.5 gallons again. So you don't necessarily have to breed a goat every year. You can breed them every 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. Your production will slowly fall off and end up like 1/3 of the full milk production weight. But if that's good enough for you, man, great. You don't have to worry about selling babies, or you can use babies to make milk or meat. And then the other thing is you don't have to worry about this buck equation, right? So here's what I do with bucks. I have the luxury not to have a buck on my ranch. Bucks are not a nice animal to have around. They stink really bad for about 6 months a year. Almost everybody isolates them, so they live by
Why
themselves.
6 months a year? What's going on there?
That's how long the rut is.
Whoa,
They're gonna,
6 months.
yeah, they're gonna start. My bucks are out there still rutting right now. It's February, and they started in August.
So you do have bucks.
I do, but here's my system. So my system is I pick 2 or 3 or 4 of my best babies out of my breeding, and then I make sure I don't breed them to somebody they're related to. And a baby goat can breed at 4 months old. 4 months. Yeah. So I breed most of my goats at 5 to 6 months old. And as soon as they're done with breeding, I castrate them and I turn them into a packer. So that way I don't ever have to have a buck around. I just breed to my next year's babies. And the way I counsel people to do it with a small herd, if you get 2 bucks and 2 does, that means you can breed this the first year. Then the next year you breed this. And then the following year, the third year is the first time you're going to have to introduce outside genetics. If you establish your herd with 2 does and 2 bucklings that aren't related, because I can breed these 2 and then I can breed their babies to each other the next year. And then it won't be till the third year that I have to bring in outside genetics. Do you
But
understand?
yeah, but that means that you have to have them segregated.
No, not necessarily. You just,
Only
yeah, there's two ways to segregate a buck that's trying to impregnate a doe before you want to. That's to put them in their own pen, or they actually make this little band that you can put down that kind of blocks their wiener from being able to go in a, right?
really
Yeah,
okay.
it's called a buck apron, and they wear a buck apron around their belly, and then they can't insert. So it makes it so that they can't breed, but they're still coexisting.
They can try
Because
how they want.
right. And here's why you would want to do that. Why you would want to do that. So goats have a 5 month gestation period. They start going into heat in August and September. So if you breed that goat in September, you at 6,000 feet in Colorado, you're going to be squirting out babies the end of February. It's still colder than shit, right? So what you want to do instead is you want to start breeding in October or November, so you're producing legitimate spring babies. So that's why you would want that buck not to breed your does those first couple of months, and that's where you would need either segregation or the buck apron. So do you understand that?
I do, and it sounds like, from my takeaway from that, a little bit different than what you're explaining right now. But my takeaway, getting started, bucks are not the answer. Don't go down that road unless you're planning on what? I mean, what would be the benefit of me getting
Yeah.
started, or anyone, they've got experience with livestock. That's not a concern. They've got the correct setup. They're prepared for it. How many are you starting with? Do you avoid the buck to begin with? Are you doing
Okay.
2 and 2? Can you get away with just two? You can get away
A buck and a
with
doe.
a buck and a doe. Like, yeah, go through the ideal initial setup for I'm
And
getting started now.
this would be for a packer setup or a person who's looking for purely milk and meat.
Packer setup with milk.
Okay. Packer
So
setup with
dual.
milk.
Yep.
Okay. So I personally believe that most people should get their pack string started with 3 to 4. That's your foundational string. That's who you're going to be packing with till they're 9 and 10 years old. So these goats are the ones you're going to work with for a lot of years. You have to remember that the Achilles heel of pack goats is that they start packing at I start packers at about 2.5 with minimal weights. I load them pretty decent at 3, and then I give them full loads at 4. And so if we're starting them at 2, they're kind of slowing down at 9. That means we have a 7-year window where they're in their prime. And that's one of the inherent negatives of goats, is that they have a short lifespan. They live the same time as a dog, 12 to 13 years, and it's their teeth that kill them, by the way. Another interesting subject. But that time frame of having that ideal packer in our string, what you have to be thinking about is walking your ages through the future. So if we start with 3 now and they're 4 years old, 2 years from now, you're going to need to add 2 more so that you have some old guys that are going out, some young guys that are coming in, and the meat of your string in the middle. So if my ultimate goal was to have 6 packers, I would start with 3 or 4. 2 years from now, I'd buy another 2. And then I would go from there. Now, if you also combine that with milkers, then you would have 1 or 2 milkers. And what my suggestion would be is let these girls grow up. Don't make them have babies on their first year, because that takes a lot of skill to help a young doe have a baby. And I always tell people, once you start getting into breeding and milk, you're into PhD level. Raising wethers, just raising packers, that's high school level. That's okay. They're very simple. You only have one thing to think about. I can give you the program in 20 minutes. But as soon as you start having babies and milking and an udder to take care of and a breeding cycle and bucks, and everything gets more. So my suggestion usually is get 3 to 4 packers and get 2 does. And then let that doe grow up 1 year. Don't breed her the first year. Let's breed her the second year. Then you can come back to me and we can help you introduce some good genetics that will get you started with your breeding pool. But you accomplish one of the major tasks was getting a doe over 1 year old so you could breed her second year. You should know I breed all my does their first year, but I have tons of experience. I've never lost a doe breeding her the first year. Does naturally have does their first year. The rule is they have to be 70 pounds. So when they're 70 pounds, they're big enough to breed and to be able to effectively have a baby. So
Are
if
you
my,
able to gauge that by eye?
no,
70?
I have a scale.
Okay.
Yeah. And the workaround on scales, if you need to weigh goats, is when they're little, you can just do the whole hold them, stand on the bathroom scale thing. And then the next step of not having to buy a scale is to go to a recycle center. You'd be amazed how jovial people are to say, hey, yeah, come down to where I weigh aluminum cans and stand your goat on my thing. I think it's cool. And that's how I used to get my weights on goats before I had a scale. But if you're going to be a serious goat owner, having a scale around to weigh them for parasites and dosages and monitoring their physical condition, those sorts of things, having a scale around is a nice tool for an advanced goat owner that needs more information.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I appreciate that. The going forward with the packing, our goats. I want you to paint the picture of how you transport these goats to the trailhead. And are you confident, or how do you gauge if I can get there? You and I, you're probably much more so than I am, but with the terrain that we live in here, our property, my enjoyment of the backcountry, I can get a lot of places that I feel pretty comfortable getting to.
Mm-hmm.
And I know my capacity is greater than someone that hasn't done it before. With that said, do I know if I can get there, the goats can get there? That's not a question. Or are there things that they can't do? And then that first part of that question is, how are you getting them to the trailhead? How are you getting
Okay.
them?
So you might have to remind me on the second part. We're talking about potential things I have to plan for in advance when I'm getting ready to go into these areas. So that's a big question, but I want to answer the other one on transport. So I use two different systems. I invented a goat hauler that fits right in the back of my pickup and has compartments on the side. The problem with hauling goats in your pickup is, number one, you can't have wind blasting on them. It'd be like you standing in the back of the truck doing 60 miles an hour with wind blowing on your face and then showing up to the trailhead 6 hours later and being ready to rip. It's exhausting for them. They're fighting the invisible man. Every time you turn a corner, they're not ready for it. Hauling goats is hard on them. And any stock animal. So the rule is 1 hour in the trailer equals 2 hours on the trail. So if you're hauling them for 4 hours, they've basically been on the trail for 8. So my rule of thumb is anything over a 3-mile or a 3-hour trip to the trailhead, I sleep on the trailhead, let them recover, and I take off next morning first thing, right? Because we got dirt roads out here that are 100 miles long and take 3 hours to navigate to get to our trailheads. We have so much remote country here in Idaho. So I haul them either in the goat hauler in the back of my pickup, or I use a small stock trailer. So you can do horse trailer, and I can fit 6 goats in the back of my truck, and I can fit like 15 goats in a 2-horse trailer. So having both of those resources is nice. Now, when I'm planning trips, if I don't know the area, then I map out my entire course and I use the inReach. I'm very mindful because it's only 10% of our trails in Idaho are maintained. So lots of times I'm literally looking at my GPS like this going, okay, where's the trail? And then I got to go 250 yards up and I can see a little remnant of the trail and I'm like, okay, cool, I'm on it still. That's what a lot of our trails look like. They're covered in brush, they're hard to find. So I really want to know my distinct drainages, my entry and my exit, and then I always figure out a dump out plan. So if I'm 16 miles in, does it make most sense for me to go back to the trailhead I left from, or is there a trailhead that's closer where I can call for help? And I always let my family know my primary trailhead and my secondary trailhead, and I won't go anywhere else. Okay, so that's having home support. The other thing I'm commonly looking at is fords. So too big of a river to cross can shut down a whole trip fast, right? And so I'm constantly conscientious of really heavy fords or super heavy running mountain water. That super heavy running mountain water can be only a a 9-foot wide creek, but it's a freaking torrent and it'll drown you and your goats. You need to know that before you get there. So I check water conditions. I know my mountains, so I know which ones are going to be accelerated. And then the other things that I'll commonly do is I'll try to create an awareness of where my water sources are going to be. So if I'm going to cover 16 miles on the trail, luckily most trail miles happen in the valleys. So the predominant amount I'm going to do, and where you're in valleys, you're in water. Now, one of the great things about goats is they don't need a lot of water. I've done 100-mile trips before where not one goat drank all 100 miles.
Wait,
So
you
it's
hiked 100 miles and the goats did not consume any water for
right.
100. How many days is that?
It was 10.
What?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that goats are one of the few animals that can draw the majority of their moisture out of forage. So
Okay.
when you're in that high mountain, super lush, green
It's
forage,
June and everything is just starting to pop out and it's fresh
right? Yeah.
shoots. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They will rarely drink. It'll usually be about 1 out of 6. A couple of goats will stop and take a little slurp. And then the rest of my goats will just stand there and look at everybody like, what are you doing? So these guys can tank up. They can hold a lot of water. And they just don't need a lot, and they get a lot out of their forage. And if you go into areas, and people who haven't spent a lot of time in the high country don't realize how dry that environment is up there. There's not a lot of water up there. I mean, the only catchments are these high mountain lakes, and often they don't have an inlet. They're just there as a seep. And so finding high water is really, really important. And having a stock animal that doesn't have to be camped on water, needs a low enough amount where he can actually haul it for himself, that's massive. There's nobody else who can do that in the stock world. Nobody else needs a little amount of water and can haul their own water themselves and be able to operate proficiently for days in the backcountry without it. So that's a big advantage too, but I'm still always mindful of that. The other thing I'm mindful of is my loads versus my elevation game and difficulty of trail. So if I know I'm going to be jumping a lot of logs, fighting brush on a shit trail for 8 hours, I'm not loading everybody with 50. I'm loading everybody with 25. I know they're going to battle that trail just as much as me. So I'm not going out heavy on that kind of trail. So I need to have an idea of the difficulty. I need to have the idea of the gain, the total mileage, the difficulty of the trail. And then what I do is I adjust my luxury. So if I have to adjust my luxury, what kind of food I'm taking in, how big a tent I'm sleeping in, can I stand up and pull up my pants tent? Or is it I'm laying like a tube worm in a little sock tube because I'm trying to keep the goats light? So I'm constantly thinking about that as I'm approaching my trips. Who's coming along, quality of food, quality of luxury. And then I have the one benefit that a lot of people don't have, which is I have 11 strong packers out there. So if I need 4, I can get 4. If I want 7, I need 7. If I need all 11, I haul in 4,000 pounds in bear bait every year, up to 9 miles back in hunting bears, all on goats. So we haul 4,000 pounds of bait back there. It's awesome.
What? That is great.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the ideal number of goats? Like, if 2 questions. If I plan out the perfect camping backcountry trip and I'm not going to have to carry a backpack, I'm going to bring the goats. What's the ideal number for a single person, an individual? And then maybe 2, how many goats are we taking? And are there any restrictions on any? I know I'm in Colorado, you're in Idaho. I know things are different, but generally it's the same. When you see a sign that says, that has a horse on it, at the trailhead, is that the thumbs up that you can take goats, or is there no restrictions across the West on taking goats into the backcountry?
Well, okay, so big subject. So I'll answer the one. There are restrictions, and it's really unfortunate that there are, because it's another case in the United States where money outlives or outwins it. Money and influence beats out sensical thinking, right? I know that's a common thing in our culture nowadays, right?
Sure is.
Well, we're suffering it in goats as well. And know that as I say this, I'm not incriminating this group at all. I love wild sheep. I want to hunt wild sheep. There's nothing I would do to help preserve wild sheep. But when what happens is goats can carry a disease called MOV. MOV is the pneumonia that kills wild sheep. The problem with an MOV is that it's really easy to incriminate this one bug as the thing that's going to kill all the sheep. The problem is that you have MOV currently in caribou, whitetail, mule deer, elk, moose, mountain goats, and bighorn sheep. Oh, and it was 7 out of 500 packers that were tested had MOV as well, and they were all babies. So here's what would have to happen, by the way. We studied all the pack goats about 8 years ago. We nasal swabbed every single one of them. Out of 557, we had 7 juveniles that had MOV, not a single adult. So if that statistic is even assumed to be close to accurate, here's what would have to happen to infect a wild sheep. Number one, I would have to have the statistical, very low probability of, number one, having a goat with MOV, right? Number two, I would have to lose them. That's never happened to me in 6,500 trail miles and 12 years in the backcountry. So that's a pretty low probability as well. Then the last probability that's crazy is that goat would have to go find a wild sheep herd, be sloughing the virus at the exact moment that he touched nose to nose with a sheep for that to happen. So now we're talking about statistical analysis that is lower frequency than getting struck by lightning, yet we're banning people out of the backcountry. And why? Because the most well-funded animal on planet Earth is wild sheep. They have more money behind them than any other animal on the planet. It's the most radio-collared animal on the planet. And now to hunt a wild sheep costs $60,000. No wonder there's so much money behind them, right? So now we have this advocacy group that only is thinking about one thing, and they have tons of money, tons. And so, yes, we are not allowed, unfortunately, in some wilderness areas that hold sheep. And we have an advocacy group called the North American Pack Goat Association, which to be a member of costs a whopping $20. So we don't have any money either. And we go out there and try to fight for our rights with the national forest and public lands and say, no, you're not right. And yes, we have a lawyer and we've won in court a number of times, but you can't win them all. And it's a frog in the pot, right? We need people like you that have a bandwidth to help us get the message out there and to fight for our rights to be on public land. I mean, I'm in the largest public land state in the nation other than Alaska, right here in Idaho, 76% of our state. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been going in the backcountry my whole life, it seems like we're trying to go in the direction as the managers where human beings are supposed to drive past on the road and go, hey, look at those beautiful mountains. We can't go in them anymore, but look how beautiful they are. I think that's where they eventually want us because they see us as the invader into that natural environment rather than the participant and rather than the owner, which we are. We own that land. So we need to be more better about that. Now, Colorado has almost no restrictions. Idaho has 2 wilderness areas. Wyoming has 1 wilderness area. Washington State has another wilderness area. But they keep trying consistently to do that. And they have legitimate concerns. I would be scared about the well-being of sheep too. But, you know, it's just it's my critter over your critter style of thinking.
Yeah, well, it's
and I got more
education
money
too, from
than
what you were
got.
saying.
It is. It really is just an education on risk factor. Now, what was the question that you asked me? Oh, in terms of keeping him out of there. I gave you the information that I meant to there. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, first, I mean, following up on that, how does a person know I can't take my pet goats in?
It's all published. You would have a hard time finding places you can't go, but it's all on NABCA. Like for example, if I'm going into a new wilderness area that I've never been in, I always call the Forest Service office that regulates that area. I say, hey, I'm getting ready to go in on, such and such trail. I want to check the river conditions. Have you heard about it in there? By the way, I have stock. Is there any stock restrictions in the trail? By the way, I never say I have goats, because some people still don't even know that pack goats are feasible in the national forest. They don't even know it's a thing. So I consider myself just another stock animal. So I always ask myself, are there any stock restrictions? If there's no stock restrictions, then I'm not restricted either, and I head in. So it's just a pretty quick phone call to find out if you're looking at a particular area. Those numbers are all Googleable. People pick up the phone, they're reachable. You can find that stuff out pretty easily. And then NAPCA, the resource group, can answer your questions that way as well.
And generally, it's not going to be posted at the trailhead. Or
no,
if I see horse, they have that little triangle. It says horses first, and then is that your clear thumbs up? Okay,
it is. Yeah,
okay.
It is. Stock accessible trails are accessible to llamas, horses, and goats, mules, donkeys, all that stuff. Those are all in the stock realm. They would have to be specific to ban a particular portion of a stock animal. By the way, so the other thing that people need to know about goats is they're the least impactful in terms of their footprint on the backcountry. So they're not scratching out huge holes around trees like horses do. They don't erode trails like horses do. They don't leave a giant horse poop on the trail like horses do. They're just little goat berries that are a mule deer. So in terms of an animal that the advocacy groups or the land managers should be promoting, it should be goats, because we're the least impactful on the land.
Yeah.
So
walk us through.
It made sense to me.
You're at the trailhead, you unload, you're ready to go. You don't have them on a leash. Mm-hmm. You bring them in. Walk us through that process. Let's say you're going 3 miles today, or give us the range of how many miles you typically feel comfortable, and what does it look like through the process? You're going to run across hikers and backpackers. Shine a light on what that looks like, and then you get
what
to
trail
camp.
life looks like.
Yeah, okay, but then also once you get to camp and it's time to set up, what does all of that look like in relation to those goats?
Okay. So when I get to the trailhead and park, the first thing we do is let the goats out of the trailer to let them stretch their legs and feel like a goat again. We let them forage around the trailhead. If there's people there, they love petting them and asking questions. And then what I do is I tie up every goat around my trailer, around my truck, and then I saddle them. I put a saddle on them. I've already preloaded the panniers at home. I never load the panniers on the trailhead because it's just more time there. I plan
Tell
everything
us what
out.
A pannier is. Can you kind of go through that?
Yeah, a pannier's the bag that hangs on the side of a goat, or a pannier, right? So it's a French word that went for that. But so the bags that hang on each side of the saddle, and our saddle is very uniquely designed in that it's custom fit. So it can fit a goat like this, and it can fit a goat like this, right? So it has 2 different swivel points. So once you turn some wrenches, you can set it on there, and it's a custom fit to specifically that goat. And the reason I stress that with people is that you got to remember, goats are one of the only animals on the planet that will die from pain. Okay. So, and what they get is a thing called goat polio, and it kills them when they're stressed over long periods of time. So goats are a tough ass animal, but they can't take like this constant nagging pain like a saddle sore. So if you develop a saddle sore on that goat, he's going to lay down. He's going to lay down. He's done. Now, what do you do at a mile 11 with a goat that lays down and you don't have anywhere to put that load? What are you going to do? Right. So that's having good saddle fit is critical. So I tell people all the time, you can go cheap on every piece of equipment out there, but you can't go cheap on the saddle. You got to get a good one. So we are going to saddle the goats. We'll load the panniers on, depending on the trail. Usually I have anywhere from, 25 to 50, even 60 and 70 pounds on my goats. But normal weights are usually 30, 40 because I do huge amounts of miles. So let's say
for people that are listening to that, if you've ever been backpacking, most people, when they're trying to go in for 6 days, from my experience, you're talking about a 40-pound pack that you've got on personally. Is that about your estimation on just a regular backpack? No, I'm not talking about hunting. I'm just talking about your regular backpacking trip.
It matters what food you eat, though, right?
Sure.
So
it matters food. You're really trying to maximize or minimize your weight.
Right. Backpackers only have one choice: elite gear and elite food. Elite food meaning the lightest food, not the most nutritional, right? Yep. And also remember that once you're above 8,000 feet, you go backwards for 6 weeks physically before you start going forward. You're digesting food worse, you're sleeping worse. There's 2 major components that make you basically get more fragile with every day in the woods. So I take my nutrition really serious when I'm back there if I want to perform and hunt elk and do all that stuff. So the answer to your question earlier that we didn't get to was how many goats am I going to need? The rule is usually one goat per person, right? So one goat can, because a goat can haul 50. If your barometer is you can do 6 days in the backcountry with 50, well then your goat's carrying the 50 and he can handle that, right? So that's kind of the rule. It's 1 to 2 goats per person depending on how good your goats are, and then you always want to leave room for packing an animal out if you're hunting, right? And I always try to have one empty goat. So in case I have one goat that goes down, I can throw the panniers on the other one and he can limp his way out. Right. And by the way, I've never had a goat get injured so bad I couldn't get him out of the backcountry. So, I've had stuff back there for sure. So on the trail, when we start out, the goats are rocket hot. You're talking goats that are in shape. They know what they're doing, and no goat wants to be at the back. So this is a dynamic of goats, right? So when you start out on the trail, I always school people, start with a human in front and a human in back. When you start with the human in back, now that human in back is the artificial, what I call wolf bait. So nobody wants to be at the back of the string because the back of the string is the most vulnerable position to predators. So when the goats are all hot in the beginning, and if I don't put that human back there, they're going to be climbing up my ass, even trying to get in front of me to make sure that they're not the one in behind. But if I put a human back there, everybody's cool in the gang. It's really cool. Then eventually, about a mile down the trail, the back goat will start holding this human being up, because that's just the way goats work. They cut in front of you. They don't want to keep stopping, stuff like that. Walking with a herd of goats is a total nightmare. Walking in front of goats or behind goats, easy peasy. But walking amongst them, they're constantly doing this thing where they step in front of you and they get in your way and they try to hold you up. So I always tell the person in the back, as soon as the goats start trying to hold you up, I'm going to pull you up front and put you in front of me. And now the goat string is going to pile up again. I'll get about another 300-400 yards down the trail, they'll string out, and then everybody stays on my ass because wolf bait is at back and wolf bait is up the ass of the guy in front of him. And so you got this night tight string. Once we get into camp, we're going to pull off all the panniers first, pull off all the saddles second, let the goats just go ahead.
Real quick question on that. They are free. There's no leash.
Never. Yeah. Okay. If you tie goats to each other or you try to lead them, your life will be not fun. Yeah, they have to be able to intermix and do their thing. You're just going to literally walk in the other direction and go goats. And because they're bottle fed and they're bonded, they will have no choice but to follow you. Okay. And this is a key part about your listeners. There's 4 things, and I want to get into this before the camp because this is really important for your people to hear. There's 4 things you need to do well if you're going to run packers. Number 1 is the right genetics. I would say humbly that I have probably the best pack goats breeding program in the world right here in Boise, Idaho. So my recommendation is that you get goats from me. And genetics are going to matter. If you raise a goat up that's a turd from the beginning because you didn't know, he's still going to be at a turd at 4, but you got $1,500 in him at least by that time. And now you got a turd. If you buy the right goat in the beginning, then he's not going to be that way at the end. So genetics is important because you're going to have so much money into raising these goats up to packer weight, right? Time, money, energy. Number 2 is an education. You have to learn how to raise goats. So you need to take the How to Raise a Baby Goat course. You need to take the Goat Mastery course. You need to take the birthing course. The birthing course, just so you know, any of your listeners that can't afford it and are going to have babies, it's the one course I'll give you for free, always. The greatest nightmare and heartbreak happens in birthing, and it's where people are most unprepared. And the devastation is the greatest because you lose both the doe and the baby at the same time, and your family's wrecked. No vet will show up to your property at 2:00 in the morning and help a goat have a baby. You have to know what you're doing. And it goes wrong a decent amount. You got to remember, you got triplets is almost the norm. So now you got all these legs, all these umbilical cords, and these huge babies trying to jockey for position of who comes out first. It can be really sketchy. You got to go in on goats. You got to go in and grab goats. You got to know what you're doing. So the birthing course is one that's a must. I have pack goat courses. I have, raising goat courses, all those stuff. But the courses are critical to your well-being in raising goats. If you do it, it'll be easy. If you don't, you'll have a nightmare. I see it again and again. Number 3 is conditioning. You have to keep your goats in shape. It's just like you can't get off the couch and go walk to 9,000 feet and do 12 miles. Neither can they. If you expect them to pull out of the pasture and go kick ass in the backcountry, you just don't know how stock animals work. They have to get in shape. And so I have 3 different methodologies that I teach people how to condition their goats, and whichever one you want to choose, it's all really doable and it's not a big deal, but you got to do it. You got to get them in shape. And the last thing, I spoke about conditioning, I spoke about education, I spoke about the right goats, and then the last thing is the saddle. You need to budget for a good saddle. My saddle is $100 more than anything else you can get out there, and worth every damn penny. It just is. It fits better. It works better. It's just a better saddle. So, that's kind of the 4 things. So that was important for you to hear. Any questions on that at all before I go into the campsite thing that you were asking me here? Okay. So campsite wise, I'm going to unload them. I'm going to get them ready. Goats chew their cud all night. So they regurgitate the food in their stomach. They pull it up. They rechew their cud and they swallow it again. In that process, they're very burpy. So they burp and make noise and paw out beds and do that stuff. So you want to camp with your goats close enough to you where they're not going to keep you up all night burping, but they're far enough there. So they're far enough away where they're not going to keep you up, but close enough that if you do have a predator in camp, you're going to be able to defend them and help them. So I'm not tying up my goats 100 yards away from me. I'm tying them up 20 yards away from me. And we use things like ground lines, high lines, and then some of us will tie to trees because they make for great umbrellas. You just got to remember that you cannot legally tie to trees with a stock animal, horse, goat, mule, whatever. You can't tie to trees. So, we'll use high lines and then high lines and low lines to tie them up. So they'll be tied up at night. And the reason we do that is that we put bells on them. So they got a little bell that sits on there. All night long, I hear kind of jingle, jingle, jingle. But then if all of a sudden I hear jingle, 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 then I know something's up. And here I am coming out of my tent 20 yards away with a gun and a headlamp, and I'm ready to do something. Now, that scenario I've been prepared for 12 years now and almost 7,000 trail miles, and it's never happened once. So just know this is not a frequent occurrence, but we're mindful of predators and how we camp. Then the other tool rules that I teach people: never let goats into your kitchen area, or you will be chasing them away with a bag of nuts every single day. So you teach them an area there's not allowed. It's super easy to do it. As soon as you roll into a camp, you give a kid a squirt bottle, and every time a goat comes into the area that I've designated as my camp where no goats are allowed, he says, "Get," and squirts them with the squirt bottle. And then they learn in about 20 minutes where they're allowed to go and where they're not allowed to go. And that's a much more peaceable existence with 6 goats that are trying to get into your bag of potato chips versus they know they can't even come in that area, right? So it's important.
Is the squirt bottle your method of training? It sounds like
it's my go-to reprimand. They hate water. They think water is acid. They hate water. They will run.
So when it rains, they're always under. They're never standing out.
Correct. In fact, if it rains in the backcountry and I'm on the trailhead, they'll climb under my truck. Isn't that funny? So you're talking a 250-pound goat with a saddle on trying to climb under my truck, and I've seen
what happens on the trail when it's raining.
They'll just go stand underneath a tree, but if I'm still walking, they'll just walk with me. It's their preference to be out of the rain, sure, but they'll stand in the rain all day long too. So, yeah. So what was I saying with the keeping them out of camp, having them close enough. Oh, and then the other thing is foraging. So remember, a goat needs to forage about 1 to 2 hours twice a day. So 1 to 2 hours in the morning, 1 to 2 hours in the evening. It's one of the most entertaining, fun things to do, to go out with your goats and have them forage. But they will naturally, while you're in camp, just wander out of camp and go forage. They'll go forage for like an hour, and I still see them or I hear them if they run out of distance, because they always have their bells. If they get out of my contact, I just yell, "Goats!" and they all come running back in full blast. So
that's a sure thing, huh? You can call them.
Yeah.
And I know in one of your videos you mentioned that a horse, when lightning and you get that big crash of thunder, you mentioned that a horse is going to run the other direction, but the goats are going to run towards you. So let's Let's talk about that a little bit.
Correct. Yeah. So that's one of the benefits. One of the huge problems with horse stock is that if one breaks loose, their instinct is to run back to the trailhead, back to the trail. Now, however many miles that happens to be, and if they're all gone and they don't have their tack on them, then what do you do? It's a big deal. It's a huge deal, and
Hmm.
it happens more often than people think. So, one of the nice things about a goat is that when they're in danger, their instinct is to run to you instead of to go wherever the hell they're going to go on their own. They're very dependent. They're very herd bound. Like I have one goat that if I leave camp, he'll call for 20 minutes for me when I leave. And he's kind of a pain in the ass that way because he's so bonded, but that's how bonded they get. It's almost kind of like a live or die, not, to be around you. And in fact, sometimes wethers, when they begin learning how to forage in the backcountry, they don't want to leave camp. So I actually have to walk them out and go, come on, guys, it's time to eat, go eat. And I teach them that kind of early in their cycle. So yeah, they stick to you like glue. It's really cool.
That's amazing. And
Yeah.
your experience once you get to camp and you're squirting them, you're not allowed over here, but they are not tied up. They are allowed to freely roam and to graze until it's nighttime, and that's when you're going to bed, and that's when you've got that line and you're tying them up to that line.
Correct. Yeah. And you should just know if I let them sleep in the tent with me, they would. Like one of the biggest problems I have with goats is them getting in the tents. They
Really?
love, yeah, they'll bed in there. And yeah, I mean, they're like a dog, man. They're so similar to a dog. They just want to be around you.
Have you ever taken one of your livestock guardian dogs with you on a backcountry?
No, because I feel
Okay.
it would be irresponsible to kids or other people's dogs. I'd be too scared Storm would come across another dog and kill it. There's no freaking way I would get any sleep. If I put Storm in a camp, he'd bark
Barking.
all night long. All night long. I wouldn't get a blink.
I guess I want to thank you for answering all these questions. This was so insightful, and I think anyone that has even considered it, this is new information, like it was for me, and it's changed my perspective. And like I mentioned, starting off, life is short, and I want this experience as much as I love the Highland cattle. This utility of these goats is just so profound, and I guess I'm curious as we kind of finalize this conversation, what's the history? Because not many people know about it. When you talk about horses, the history of horse, everybody knows that. They watch westerns. You know
Mm,
the bond between a man and his horse. You understand,
mm,
like, cowboys. You get all that. This whole goat thing is not commonly spoken of. Like you mentioned, when you're on the trail, people are going, "What is this? What are you doing? Goats?"
mhm.
Is there a history? Is
There
this
is.
recent? Is
Yeah.
this like the 70s and 80s? All of a sudden, some guy decided to start doing this. What does that look like?
Right. Good question again. Uh, globally, you should know they've been putting loads on goats since humanity existed. So this is not a new phenomenon. Now, the sophistication, just like America always is, we figure out kind of like how to really take it to the next level, right? So that's what we've done. We've made the gear and the equipment and the breeding, and we're doing things that nobody's ever done before with goats. So that's cool. But the history is there was a guy named John Mayensinski here in the United States. He's brilliant. He's still alive. In 1972, he was studying bighorn sheep in the winds in Wyoming. And because of the remoteness of the difficult terrain, he could not keep mules healthy and functioning well at those elevations because there's not good feed, right? So you got to remember with a horse or a mule, you have to pack in a third of what you're packing in is their food. So one third of the weight bearing capacity is their food. So two thirds is where you can put the equipment. And he needed more equipment, didn't have enough food. And he said, man, these goats are perfect. I got two barnyard goats. Why don't I try those? So he cut a 2x4 in two pieces and a shovel handle. He cut in four, and then he wired it together with baling twine. And that was the first goat saddle in the United States. So, and John Mayensinski went up there and studied sheep for 7 or 8 years. And this is the funny part of the story is that he determined that the problem that wild sheep were having was not with MOV, it was with their immune system and the fact that the acidic rain that happens at high elevation is killing the legumes that produce selenium. And so a selenium deficiency is the fastest way to make a goat have a horrible immune system, get, tipped over by a common cold. So what he started doing was using goats to place selenium blocks throughout the sheep herd. And all of a sudden he tripled lamb survival rate his first year, and he doubled it his second year. In his third year, there was a big winter kill, and they said, it must not work. And that's the last time they freaking tried it, if you could believe it. I'm like, what? Why? What? You got more money than anything, and why don't you just supplement these guys? If all they need is mineral, we'll hike it in for you.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you choosing that option? So I don't quite understand what they're thinking there. But John Mayansitsky is a brilliant man, brilliant, kind, thoughtful. But I think it's fair to call him the grandfather of goat packing here in the United States. And then when I came on the scene, I was a fairly big personality in the hunting industry. So once I started doing it and posting about it, people started asking about it. When I started 12 years ago, I would say there was maybe 100 packers in the United States, goat packers. There's probably 4,000 now. So we definitely expanded the sport, improved the equipment, improved the breeding, improved the knowledge, improved the education. We've just been pushing it forward.
Well, I appreciate it. Where can people find you?
That's a good question. Okay. So Marc Warnke is a brand throughout. Anybody can Google the goat guy and they'll find me, because that's what I'm known as globally, as the goat guy. My primary websites in the goat business are packgoats.com. So that one's really easy to remember. And then, of course, I got the full spread across the YouTube channel, Instagram, Facebook, and all that fun stuff as well. But packgoats.com or the goat guy, you'll find me wherever you look.
Love it. Everyone go follow Marc. Even if you don't have any inclination or the space or the lifestyle to do this, you're going to find the entertainment of it, because these goats, like you mentioned, have personality, and learning and understanding something that is so foreign to so many people is going to make you more well-rounded. Marc, thank you so much for your time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for asking such good questions. Thank you for listening so well. I'm grateful for you to help us spread the message of goats and their benefit to human beings. We shouldn't be the only country in the world that forgot about goats. I want to be the country in the world that remembered about goats. So,
love it. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.